Hi everyone, welcome to the Athletic Skills Podcast, and today I've got Dan Richardson on. So Dan, thank you very much for joining.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
So Dan, I know you just mentioned you've done a few podcasts before, so then people might have seen you on different podcasts. But I know you've got a big, or a wide range of backgrounds in terms of different sports that you work in. But I want to find out kind of why did you fall into kind of nutrition? So you mentioned you played a little bit of sports as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose nutrition found me as opposed to I found nutrition. And I think fall into nutrition is probably the best way of describing it. I was effectively a failed rugby player. I got to a level of which, was a good standard of rugby. There wasn't really much going on for me when I was 18, apart from either play at my local side for very little money on a kind of semi-pro part-time contract. I believe it was about £40 a week, but I'll have to pull that one out or get the receipts out of that one, or go off to university and study what started out as sports science, because I really didn't know what discipline I wanted to go into. I remember speaking with a careers advisor and said, I just want to remain in sport for as long as I can, whether that be a practitioner or a professional athlete. And a very abrupt conversation with my dad. He explained that if I was going to be a good enough rugby player, if I went and did it at university, somebody would pick me up whilst I was at university, or potentially after university. And if not, at least I had a plan B to fall back on. So very wise words from my father. And that led me into kind of studying sports science, and then realizing that to be a sports scientist, you kind of had to go and do a master's, or you can specialize in a different discipline and going on like into a different role, whether that be a physio, S&C, or as I found an interest in sports nutrition. And that led me to do a master's in sports nutrition. And then I suppose since graduating in 2019, I've spent kind of the last 6 years working with professional athletes across a variety of different sports. Started interestingly in rugby league, working with athletes in rugby league, and then ventured out into other sports as well.
So, as a practitioner, that's probably a little bit different to other people that maybe work specifically in one sport. How do you sort of adapt your practice across different sports? Are there a lot of commonalities? Is it quite a lot of differences where you've got to kind of put a different hat on in terms of what environment you're in? So, yeah, how do you adapt across different sports?
Yeah, I think it was always going to be a challenge, when I pulled out of an individual sport and started working with a variety of athletes. I feel like I almost soft launched myself into that, as opposed to going all out straight away. So when I first started as a consultant, I worked with maybe 15 to 20 individual athletes across a variety of sports, which allowed me to make the mistakes of coupling sports together and realizing that the demands are very different, or at least going away and looking at the different research that's out there on different sports before diving into a club or a team of athletes. And those one-to-ones were really valuable for my almost CPD or my learning, because it allowed me to be able to actually start to understand the different demands of each sport from an individual basis, as opposed to just jumping in at a club level. So I think there is some nuances in sports nutrition which remain the same. We know that carbs give us energy, protein supports muscle protein synthesis in all sports. Most or all athletes have muscles. Most and all athletes have some form of need of fuel. So they know that they need carbohydrates and fats to fuel the body. But it really does differ, especially when we're talking about individual sports and team sports. And that was where I suppose the research really helped, looking up and actually reading papers around utilization of macronutrients, micronutrients, understanding and supporting athletes that are injured within that individual sport can be very different to a team sport, and just trying to kind of get a good base knowledge. And I feel as though I'm almost there with the sports that I work with, but there's still times where I'll find myself on PubMed or on Google Scholar looking at different articles and reading the latest research to try and stay ahead of some of the trends in some of the sports I work in. But I think once you get a base level of knowledge across all sports, it's quite easy to continue to top up that knowledge.
Yeah, it's like the physical side where you need to do a needs analysis, and almost like it's balancing also the research. I know you mentioned you do a lot of stuff within that, but also watching the game and speaking to people within the game as well, and finding context in terms of players, how players feel during a game, but also viewing might be the demands on the game or maybe a coach's viewpoint as well. So there's kind of a lot of different parts there, I guess, in there to learn about.
Absolutely. And you go back to saying watching the game, there's a few sports that I played when I was younger, your classic kind of like hockey, rugby, football, maybe a little bit of basketball. But actually, when I'm working with netball athletes, I've never played the game of netball. So quite often it was really important when working in netball just to be courtside at training sessions, at matches, to understand the demands firsthand of what the players were going through before trying to almost bring in any form of intervention. Similarly with lacrosse, I still don't quite understand lacrosse to this day in terms of everything that goes on, but I have a good enough knowledge to be able to watch a game and understand, kind of what's at play and what's going on in those certain moments and situations. Whereas, rugby, I almost don't need to watch it because I played it for so many years and feel as I still understand the game and still watch the professional game. So working with rugby players, I can resonate really quickly with, but sometimes it takes me a little bit of time to almost resonate with a lacrosse player or a netballer once I've started to understand those demands.
And obviously, as you got working in cricket as well, and myself working in cricket as an FC coach, there's also the variety of formats and
Yes.
the unique of a 4-day game where you play a game for 8 hours and then you come back the next day and play again for 8 hours versus a T20. So there's also that sort of side as well. You got to tackle with.
Absolutely. And cricket, again, is another one of those sports that I tried my hand at when I was younger, but wasn't very good. I was a half decent batsman, and that was about it. I was, and not very, I suppose, gifted with any of those skill sets, and was very much rugby and orientated around that. But again, understanding the formats, because I think, when you play school cricket or even just club cricket, it tends to be one format. You don't necessarily, especially as a player that didn't play very much or at all, was, understanding the demands of a T20 versus a 4-day, but then also understanding the changes that occur within that 4-day. For example, that there might be a rain delay, or a full day might be, abandoned due to rain, or it might even end early on a day 3 due to the fact that we've already won or they've already won. And trying to understand all of that and bring that to life can be a challenge. But I think when it comes to cricket nutrition, as long as you can get your processes in place, especially when it comes to nutrition, I think really important for any format, and adapting certain habits and behaviors within each format is more beneficial than going after a very specific strategy, because a specific strategy requires the fact that you're going to do exactly the same thing every single time. Like a footballer, you can trust they're probably going to play 90 minutes if they're one of the key players in that game. A rugby player most likely going to play 80 minutes, so you can plan for that. However, if you're a cricketer, you might be chopping and changing how many overs you do depending on how the game's going. You might also potentially go into bat, but actually maybe face 2 balls and you get out straight away, or you might end up smashing 200 balls and hitting your century. So it's trying to make sure that the habits and behaviors are built as opposed to specific outcomes, because if we work on outcomes in cricket, they're so variable that actually it becomes a huge challenge to be able to map and factor that in. So yeah, a lot of the work that I do with the lads in cricket is around what can we do in terms of building up towards the game to make sure that we've got stored energy, we've got the availability to kind of go further if needed, but then at the same time, between days, are we recovering, refueling, and rehydrating? So sticking to those 3 habits of the 3 hours of recovery and making sure that they're being addressed, as opposed to giving specific numbers and specific tasks for them to do, because again, like I say, the nature of cricket can change so much.
And we've mentioned there the variety of sports that you work in, but also within that sport and within the team, there'll be so many different terms of goals that people are working on, preferences of foods, intolerances, all sorts. So I imagine you do quite a few one-to-ones or being quite individualized as well, which can be
Yes.
hard within the big team context. So how do you sort of adapt your practice when you're working within that team when you've got lots of different individuals working on different things?
Yeah, whenever I'm working with a full squad or a club or a team of athletes, I see it as kind of like a 2-pronged approach. So the whole group stuff that you do can be really good for building baseline knowledge, can be really beneficial for helping those that potentially just need a reminder of how nutrition works. So kind of keeping it very big picture when it comes to working with a kind of a large group of athletes. Then there's kind of a middle tier that I think quite a lot of I suppose practitioners sometimes forget about, which is breaking that larger squad down into smaller groups to begin with before hitting the one-to-ones. So there might be a group of players within, let's say, a rugby team that are all working on their body composition. They might be trying to build lean mass and working with the S&C coach, doing extra strength and conditioning sessions. bringing them together and having a conversation, whether that's a roundtable discussion, maybe that's a small seminar or presentation that you can kind of go back and forth and talk to them about, with ways in which they can help to build more lean mass through nutrition, is kind of a good way of tackling a one-to-one approach without having to dive into the one-to-ones. And then from there, you can pick off the athletes within that group that maybe need the additional support from there. So I think starting really big and funneling down until you get to the ones that really need that one-to-one support. And there'll always be some that, just want the one-to-one support, which is completely fine. And, they'll do all of the group stuff, but still want reassurance that they're doing the right thing. And I think when you get to that one-to-one level, that's where you can start looking and picking off kind of individual programs similar to an S&C coach. You can start looking towards kind of food diaries and assessments of current eating habits. I always believe, and I say this a lot, that athletes shouldn't stick to a strict meal plan unless they're weighing in specifically for their sport. It should be a freedom to roam with food, but within reason and within the confinements of their sport. So, if we know an athlete needs to eat a lot more food than what they currently are, instead of giving them a caloric goal to get them to hit every day and they're tracking it on MyFitnessPal or Nutritics or wherever, actually get them to, visually send the pictures in and then have the conversation with them about how much food they're having and where their energy balance lies. Calories is a word I'm not a huge fan of as a nutritionist. I think calories are energy. So speaking to athletes about getting enough energy into the body daily is a good way of seeing it as a positive, as opposed to often, I think, in the media and the way the government spin calories, it's almost like you've only got a finite amount of calories you're allowed in a day. If you go over that, it's going to be a problem. But for most athletes, they tend to be under eating. So a lot of my work in a one-to-one capacity is trying to build on, I suppose, the work I've done in the group settings, and then almost trying to build more robust structures for them so that they're able to go and kind of achieve success with their nutrition.
I'm thinking as well, because a few sports coaches or P teachers and maybe XSC coaches will be listening to this. So not necessarily sports nutritionists, but you mentioned a lot of your work there is around education, and which is something that they can do in their practice. So what sort of strategies that really work for you in terms of that education work? Is it maybe like whiteboard work or presentations? Is it more discussion based? Is it practical sort of stuff? So yeah, what sort of educational practices kind of work well for you within kind of your teams?
I think for me, a variety of different styles of sessions. I think there's moments in the season which calls for, like you mentioned, a whiteboard session or a actual physical presentation. Like for example, at the start of the season, it's quite good to address the group of athletes with a fairly formal presentation. I think because they're almost expecting it, and it almost becomes a little bit of a tick box that session will be there, but it's how you word and style that session can be really important for the level of engagement that you'll get out of it. So I think starter seasons, I always like to do kind of a reintroduction, welcome back. Nutrition is going to look like this season. This is kind of the resources we're going to go after and the targets we're going to go and aim for. But then throughout the season, I think it's about just dripping it into the players, drip feeding it in different ways. So sometimes that is before a gym session, get them all on, let's say, the spin bikes in the gym and have them kind of like me at the front with a whiteboard, just jotting down ideas and notes and different things. Some of it can be practical based. So I do a lot of work in academies and often with younger athletes working around that practical setting. So whether that's building the perfect lunch, whether that's kind of building smoothies for them to have pre or post training, and trying to tie it into the day itself. I can't stand when a practitioner, especially nutrition, says, right, we're going to do a smoothie practical and we're going to do it at 11 a.m. in the morning, and then they're going to take the smoothies home that evening. It's like, how can we incorporate that into the day? So for example, setting the task as you're going to create a post training smoothie, and as you come off the field, I'm going to come and deliver them to you to start sipping on to make sure they taste good. Or for example, if they're doing a cooking session, as I do with some of the academy players, we'll actually take them to the shops to go and buy the ingredients, as opposed to just getting the kitchen team to order it in, because they then get a feel of what it's like to go and buy that food, which they're going to have to do if they're going to make that recipe themselves at home and then cook it themselves and try and time it so once they finish cooking, it's almost either lunchtime for them or their evening meal, so they can all sit and eat it together, instead of saying box that up, take it home, eat it later, and it probably ends up in the left in the car or in the bin on the way home. So I think a mix of educational practices, theoretical, practical, jumping on whiteboards, having some short slides. Often discussions can be quite good, but making sure that obviously you've got an agenda as to how it's going to look. So sometimes I'll do sessions where I'll quite literally have 4 slides, 4 questions, and we'll run through those questions together, as opposed to having loads of things pop up on the slides, because I think sometimes the art of conversation is really important, as opposed to just kind of losing yourself in your almost lecture style slides that I see a lot of practitioners do.
Yeah, I was chatting to another nutritionist who works within football, and he says that he gets his best work or best sort of education stuff when he stands at the coffee machines, just has a coffee with the player and just gets to kind of an informal chat, and then that's when players maybe start to open up. So rather than in that group setting, which I'm sure you've had, because it can be quite a hard topic to talk around for someone in terms of nutrition in some settings.
Absolutely. Similar to me, coffee machines, stood queuing up for food at lunch, or even pool tables, dartboards, all of those aspects, especially if I know that I've got to have some form of a difficult conversation with an athlete. So maybe it's around that they're not hitting their targets from a body comp perspective, or they're potentially not doing as I'm kind of asking. I find that like removing the stigma of sitting face to face, one to one, and almost having that direct conversation. Some athletes don't really enjoy that kind of, I suppose, cold shoulder aspect of kind of like hard hitting facts. But during a game of pool where you're not really making any eye contact, there's a stimulus that isn't just a laptop and looking at numbers on a screen, but you can actually get away with almost, showing them, like, this is where you're currently at with your nutrition between shots, for example, or like you say, over a coffee at the coffee machine while we're deciding if you're getting a latte or flat white, or similarly if we're in the lunch queue, and it's almost kind of like a conversation that we can strike up whilst waiting. I think they're the times where you get the most out of a player. Often when you drag them into a one-to-one, they're almost premeditating their answers as to what I want to hear. Whereas catching them a little bit off guard, and I know, sometimes it can help steer the conversation in the right direction. Whereas if they've come with a pre-planned response to what I'm going to ask, you almost just get the generic kind of feedback that you'd expect from an athlete.
So I want to move on to some of your nutrition strategies and kind of around fueling. So well, let's put into a football sort of context, because it's kind of getting to that stage where we're going from in season to off season, and then we'll be moving to pre-season. So how does your, let's say, fueling strategies maybe differ for the players in terms of maybe going from off season to pre-season to in season? Is there quite a big differences there in terms of what so you're applying to the players?
Yeah, so I think specifically in football, what we have to remember is players typically have about 2 weeks off completely, and we kind of shut them down for a full 2 weeks in the off season, and then they'll have their running and their gym program, which they'll do on a twice or 3 times or 4 times basis, depending on what's expected of them from the strength and conditioning and the physical development team. And then I'll factor in the nutrition in and around that. So one of the big aspects for me is making sure we get our carbohydrate periodization right. So protein remains the same regardless whether we're in or off season, in my opinion. Some research may suggest that we can reduce the amount of protein that we consume because we're not necessarily doing as much exercise. But I think the detriment of chopping and changing the amount of protein that we have on a regular basis is not very beneficial to an athlete's habit building. So I think just maintaining the same amount of protein in and out of season and in pre-season is highly beneficial for football players to maintain that habit of having 4 hits of protein a day, roughly between 20 to 40 grams per hit, and then working off obviously a gram per kilogram basis of an individualized kind of approach if needed. But ultimately, most athletes should be hitting their protein intake if they're getting kind of 20 grams minimum per kind of meal, and obviously a few snacks along the way. Carb wise, what I look to do is try and build off food plates for periodization. So in season, we talk a lot about, I call it the red plate, which is 50% carbohydrates in every single meal. So that's kind of like a high carb plate that the players would look towards in season. And ultimately that would stay true for about 4 of the 7 days of the week, because they're going to be the higher activity days, including a match. The only times we'd maybe dip away from that is +1 and +2 if they don't have a fixture coming up straight after. If we've got back-to-back fixtures, we've got to look at recomping the body quite quickly and getting fueling back into the body. Whereas if not, we can look towards a bit more of a recovery strategy. Out of season, I still use similar plates, but I've got different colours, I'm sure, to other nutritionists, and other nutritionists have different colours to me. But I go red as kind of, that's the hard hitting, like big carbohydrate plate. Green for health, so the healthy eating plate, or the Eat Well guide, which is 33%, 33%, and like a third of the plate is made up of fruit and veg and carbs. That's kind of the plate I push players towards in the off season, because they're not necessarily they are doing as much activity to some extent on some of the days if they've got a gym and also a run to do, but the level of intensity is nowhere near as high as what it is in season. Effectively, we're maintaining, ready to come back in and push for the pre-season. So utilizing that play as a fueling strategy, I think, is really important. And then similarly, I've got a blue plate as well, which is my high fruit and veg plate, low carb plate, which is a quarter of a plate carbs and half a plate fruit and veg. And obviously fats and proteins make up the rest. And that plate would be used a lot more off season for rest days, potentially when they're going away on holidays, to try and manage eating habits and making sure that they're not overindulging on carbohydrates when they're not required. So utilizing those two plates can be really beneficial. And then the minute they come back into pre-season, pretty much just about everywhere in every session that I do with them, and on the walls by the canteen, the red plate and on the TVs will just be appearing everywhere, especially day one when it's a testing day, day two when they're doing testing and football, and then obviously so on and so forth as they go into pre-season. And then we kind of adopt that plate as the majority plate that we use. But what that does is it allows me to stay away from having to almost provide gram per kilogram for every individual and then confusing them all as to how they get that food in. It allows a visual representation of that. And then, of course, as we come back into pre-season, we monitor weight, we monitor body composition. We also monitor food diaries as they're coming in pre-season. And if I feel as though somebody's under fueling or potentially not optimally fueling, that's where the one-to-one support of them understanding the quantity of carbs they're going to need on a daily basis to achieve body compositional goals or performance goals will come into play. So trying to look towards those kind of strategies that then lead into one-to-ones across the season. Off season, still doing a little bit of work with some of the injured players, making sure that they're coming back in their best kind of shape, and also some of the guys that potentially in the off season need that additional support as we kind of push through that phase.
And you mentioned there around, I'm sure within a team environment that not every individual is going to be hitting the targets, and obviously going everything what you mentioned. And there's maybe a sports coach or an S&C coach. Are there any kind of red flags or things to maybe notice from players in terms of habits, or visually from players who maybe low on energy? Let's go low on energy. Maybe whether that's in the game or within training. Are there any sort of things to be aware of? Maybe that can then say, oh, that player might be not fueled right, so maybe then you can go and have that conversation, like you mentioned, with that player around what's going on in terms of their nutrition.
I think there's so many signs and symptoms, and like a lot of the time we can look back at some of the research around REDS, which is relative energy deficiency in sport, and look at some of the kind of key factors. So, inability to recover well is often a big factor. So potentially being stiff and sore on days where they shouldn't be or didn't used to be. Low energy across the day. So that might be like yawning a lot, coming in looking very tired and fatigued, even to the point of which maybe falling asleep in video sessions, or kind of like struggling to hold conversation because of how tired they feel. Low mood can be often a factor. So if you notice that they're flaring up a lot more in training, or they're a little bit more snappy, that could potentially be a factor to them under fueling. Decreased motivation. So maybe they're somebody who's, first out on the pitch, but actually they're just sitting in the changing rooms, not bothered about coming out, or, they're first to go back in instead of, doing the extras they usually would, or they're arguing about certain aspects, can often be around fueling. Obviously, there's other elements that might be at play. And I think those are the big ones really to look out for. And then obviously the increased risk of injury that comes with all of that as well. Like if we're noticing small kind of niggles or pulling out of training early or potentially missing a couple of days a week, we can often try and factor that into low energy availability and start kind of seeing the signs and symptoms from there.
And you mentioned there around your coloured system around the plates in terms of different phases of the season. Where does supplements fit in within that? Are you a fan of supplements? Because I know the classic thing for maybe sports coach is to advise someone if they wanted to bulk up or go and get some protein shakes. I'm sure you've heard that before, or different things around that. So yeah, where does sort of supplements fit within your practice, or can people just get what they need from just general foods and eating well without any supplements?
Yeah, I think for the most part, it's the latter. Like we can get most of our nutrients through foods. There's a really good paper a few years back now that I always reference, which is by Graham Close, which was effectively I can't remember the title off the top of my head, but the way the saying goes is every nutritionist almost used to call themselves a food first nutritionist. And, whenever you talk about philosophies of nutritionists, it's like a buzzword to say that I've got a food first approach. But what the paper kind of debunked a little bit was that we need to be food first, but not food only, because there are some aspects and elements where we might want to look towards getting some form of supplements in that isn't a detriment to the athlete. So some of the ones that were looked at in the paper were your proteins, your creatines, your caffeines, and when and where to use them. I think there's a time and a place for them in certain settings. And, for the most part, footballers don't necessarily need a protein shake because they're not carrying 120 kilograms of lean mass like a rugby player. So actually their gram per kilogram is fairly low of what they require from a kind of protein standpoint. Whereas a rugby player may struggle to get the protein in without eating copious amounts of meats and foods. So a shake might be beneficial there. Creatine, more and more the research is emerging that it's a really beneficial supplement, not just from the athletic performance point of view, but also from a cognitive function aspect. So again, creatine we can get through foods, but I do believe that to get 10 grams of creatine through foods, we need 2.5 kilograms of salmon, I think is the exact equation. Don't quote me on that. But again, a ridiculous number. So it's very hard to get the amount of creatine we need that we see beneficial in the research to actually be able to get through foods. Obviously, there's a few bits and pieces around age ranges for supplements and things like that. But if we're looking at health-based supplements like vitamin D, we know that we aren't as fortunate to live in a lovely sunny country in the UK all year round. So we're going to need to supplement vitamin D to make sure that we're protecting our bones and supporting calcium absorption. So there's a few supplements that I'm fond of and I would use with athletes on an individual basis, but obviously there has to be a needs analysis done before using that supplement specifically. I think when looking at supplements for the younger population, I prefer to steer away from them because I feel as though there isn't as much benefit unless we're looking at potentially a youth specific supplementation strategy and it's very individualized there. Whereas as we get to the senior level, it's much easier to prescribe a supplement to utilize for an athlete because, their bodies are fully developed and they're able to kind of absorb and actually use the nutrients that are available within the supplement that's there. And normally it's to fill in the gaps that they've maybe got from not necessarily a poor diet or nutrition, but actually are unable to get it through their diet or nutrition from there. And then of course, the only bit to add to that, I suppose, is safe supplement use, making sure that it's batch tested, informed sport, and also making sure that you're buying it from a reputable source. Going down to a local, kind of supermarket and picking it up off a shelf doesn't mean it's a reliable source. We've got to go and do our due diligence, make sure it's got the informed sport logo on it that protects us, and make sure that there's no contaminants in it. And then obviously ensure and double check that on the website that the batch code is uploaded and on there as well.
Yeah, and I always say to coaches or athletes who may be asking, it's expensive as well, supplements. So if it's not, and it might be a fad for them, might have just seen someone have one and then they feel like they need one. So without actually maybe focusing on the basics, same with it, it's sort of the physical development side, they might want all the fancy gadgets and fancy things, but if they're not nailing the 90% basics that they could do, then those sort of higher end expensive things are not really beneficial. So yeah, it's sort of the same on the nutrition side.
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. I think, the one for me that stands out that, to look at is double scooping protein powder. We know that 20 grams of protein will, in most athletes, elicit good quality threshold of muscle protein synthesis, which for those that maybe are listening as an athlete is just the regeneration and regrowth of the muscles. And if we double scoop our protein to get 40 grams or 50 grams of protein in the body, then it's going to be almost non-beneficial to that process. Now, having 50 grams of protein isn't a problem because it will be used by the body. But if we are literally going after recovery of the muscles, muscle protein synthesis, and heightening that, then we are basically shooting ourselves in the foot because we don't need the double scoop of protein to be able to actually hit that, and we're just effectively wasting money on using it.
I just want to finish off on one classic question that I always get from coaches around, let's say, a pathway coach who is working with a group of younger players on an evening, could be across different sports, but let's say a 2 hour session, and their player comes, let's say, 5, 6 o'clock, and they haven't had tea yet. They've come straight from school. So what would you sort of advise that coach to maybe recommend to their athletes to bring to that session, to make sure they're fueled enough for whether that's a technical session or a physical session? But classic thing is that a player, you ask a player and they say, "Oh, when was the last time you ate?" Let's say it would be lunchtime, and then they're not fueled enough. So yeah, what sort of advice would you give for those coaches who are working with sort of these recreational pathway athletes to have some sort of nutrition in their work?
Yeah, it's always a huge challenge, the kind of 5, 6 o'clock starts, because it falls right in the time where somebody will be having their evening meal. I think there's a couple of ways to go about it. And I think coming back to what we spoke about quite early on in the pod around habits and changing the athlete's habit around nutrition, I think is so important. So, there isn't a quick fix, unfortunately, when they rock up to a training session. There is a way of, okay, you can have a cereal bar or some sugars to help tie you over, but ultimately it's not going to be a, optimal fueling strategy for that evening session. And doing that over multiple days isn't going to result in any kind of significant performance enhancement. So I think from the coach perspective, it's getting the athlete to understand the rationale and the reason behind why they need to eat before training, and how that might affect their ability to perform within the session. It might increase their risk factor to injury, and actually is potentially causing low energy or a poor energy balance due to the fact that they're burning all this energy, and actually when they finish later on, in that evening, they're not going to be able to actually get the foods back in to kind of balance back out their energy. So for me, I think there's two real ways to go about it. One is, like you say, lunch is kind of a large meal that they'll have in the day, and then having some snacks that lead into that kind of training session, and then maybe at 7, 8 o'clock having their evening meal afterwards. So those snacks might consist of a small sandwich, maybe a wrap, a bagel. It could be cereal bars, pieces of fruit, just interspersed from lunch up until that training session time to support fueling strategies into that session. Or the other way of doing it is to take that evening meal and split it in half. So if we're not a big fan of like a snacky kind of lead into kind of, I suppose, training, we could have our lunch, and then we could have maybe a snack to tie us over from lunch, and then around an hour to maybe an hour and a half before training, obviously coming straight from school, so it will require the habit building to take that food in with us and make sure that we're able to eat it en route to training or as we finish school. But maybe an hour to an hour and a half before, having half of that evening meal pre-training, and then of course over the other side looking towards having half of that meal again plus a snack alongside it afterwards to refuel. So the two ways really is to snack leading into training and have our big meal after training, or split that big meal into two, one pre and one post, and then having obviously a snack with each side of that to make sure we're topping up on fueling.
That's great, and I think that's and again, it's just trialing what might work for each player as well. Because for a coach, it might not be that one piece of advice works for everyone. So just emphasizing that. But no, thanks Dan for jumping on the podcast. I know you're a busy person, so I appreciate your time. So if there's anyone that's got any questions or wants to see a little bit more about your work, is there any way people can maybe get in touch with you, or just see some of the stuff maybe you posted?
Yeah, absolutely. Just a massive thanks for having me on as well. I enjoy speaking about topics like this and hopefully sharing a bit of knowledge, whether that be to an athlete, a coach, maybe another nutritionist, sparking some interest in and around that is always great. I think I'm most active on Instagram, which is at DRN Nutrition. So I think that's probably the best place to grab me. As you imagine, with all the different sports, my WhatsApp and emails tends to get blocked up quite quickly. So I think Instagram is kind of a bit of a good place to grab me because not as many people contact me on there. Yeah, looking at my Instagram is probably a good place to start if you want to grab a conversation about a specific topic you've heard today, or maybe something you haven't heard today that you want to hear more of.
No, that's great, and I'll put that in the show notes for people to come and find you. But Dan, thank you very much for joining. Really appreciate your time. I'm sure we'll definitely have you back on at some point to chat further because we haven't really touched the surface of nutrition, and we've missed out on a lot of topics we could have chatted about.
Thanks for having me.